Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Humanities Forum. Hope you're planning to be at the Humanities Forum, because you're in the right place if you are. I'm going to thank sponsors, the Drescher Center for the Humanities, the Imaging and Research Center, and the Center for Innovation, Research, and Creativity in the Arts are all sponsoring this wonderful talk by Liz Lerman. This talk is part of the Humanities Forum series of events, and I'd like to encourage you to take a look at the other events in the series, either on the flyer. There's a flyer available, yes, and or to look at the online at the dreschercenter.umbc.edu. Also, I want to invite you to the next Humanities Forum event, which will take place on Thursday, May 7th, here at 4 p.m., and that is the Lipitz Lecture, called India, Pakistan, and Nuclear Weapons, Deterrent Stability in South Asia by Devin Haggerty, Professor of Political Science and Director of the Global Studies Program at UMBC. Liz Lerman is a choreographer, performer, writer, educator, and speaker. Also, she's a thinker, instigator, excavator, and superb asker of questions. She has engaged in artistic research that spans the disciplines, from her days as a go-go dancer in the 70s to more recent work, including the topic of war, the Civil War. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. I don't have 4 pages of introductory remarks. She is the recipient of numerous honors, including a 2002 MacArthur Genius Grant Fellowship and a 2011 United States Artists Ford Fellowship in Dance. She founded Liz Lerman Dance Exchange in 1976, and the company became a force in contemporary dance. Her work expanded beyond dance, and in turn expanded dance. In 2011, she handed the reins of Liz Lerman Dance Exchange to a new generation of artists. Her publications include Hiking the Horizontal, Field Notes from a Choreographer, collection of essays, and her critical response process, which describes her step-by-step method for providing relevant and invigorating feedback on creative work of any kind. A key aspect of her artistry is opening her process to various publics, from shipbuilders to physicists, construction workers to ballerinas, resulting in both research and outcomes that are participatory, relevant, urgent, and usable by others. So without further ado, I'd love to welcome Liz Lerman.
Thank you, Carol. It's really special to have Carol do the introduction. In the world of dance, we come in and out of each other's lives over whatever life we're given. And it's nice to be in your orbit again, Carol. Also, I wanted to add my thanks to all the people that made it possible for me to be here, and to all of you who would take a beautiful day like today and come inside and spend it with me, thinking about what I hope is of interest to all of you. I have to acknowledge that actually, I don't mind talking, but giving talks is really difficult for me. And one of the reasons it is because in choreography, you know, I can put a whole bunch of things on the stage at once, and they can relate to each other, and you get to choose what to look at. It's really fun. But when I talk, I have to talk in a sentence, and then in a row, and then I find that just so challenging. So even like 2 minutes ago, I was over there thinking, I'm not sure what sequence to use. So bear with me, and we'll jump in. Sometimes, maybe I'll think of it like this. Let's pretend it's a theater. There's a curtain back here. I'm in front of the curtain, and we're just having a little prologue. And I can kind of mess around a little bit, and then we'll open the curtain and get at some of this. But I wanted to talk today about the kind of research that happens for artists in our own work, in our own little worlds, and in the worlds we create for audiences, and then in all the worlds we create by moving around the world. And I want to actually quote a scientist, because a lot of what I'm going to speak about is my work with scientists. But I love Nobel Week, you know, when the radio has all those interviews, and you know, you hear these people, they've probably worked on the same problem for like 50 years. And whatever it is they did, they're getting the Nobel for something that happened, you know, like way back. But then the radio makes them say it in like 2 sentences, or maybe a half a sentence, right? And what I have to tell you, I don't know who this was, because I had just turned on the radio, and all I heard was why did you get the Nobel? And he said, I got it for rattling around in other people's universe. I love that, right? When we wander out of our discipline, our home, our refuge, our family, we spend time in these other places. What happens to us? How are our own ideas sharpened, and how are we able to contribute maybe differently in the world? Now, I have to tell you, I was raised as a classical dancer first, and there wasn't much wandering in other people's universes in that world. In fact, in the period in which I was raised in dance, you were only allowed one teacher. And you know, if you went across the street to some other studio, oh my God, it was like the most worst thing you could do. That was not good grammar, but it reflects on how bad it was. And certainly you wouldn't study across genres, like, which is what is expected of dancers now. But in my case, it was in my 20s when my mother's sudden death of cancer was so disturbing to me and so disrupting that I decided to make a dance about what had happened to us. And also, I decided I needed old people to be in it. She wasn't that old when she died, but I pictured all these old people. And I was thrust by a total urgency to go into a world I would never have gone into otherwise. I mean, I was quite happy in my professional dance world. And then this thing happened, and I decided that I had to have old people be in the piece to welcome my mother to whatever had happened to her and whatever realm she'd gone into. So, you know, I was not courageous. I was not brave. It was not radical. I was not being innovative. I was a very, very sad young woman who needed to do this thing, and went and found, well, actually, I couldn't find old people. In 1975, it's not like now where we're everywhere. In fact, you would like to get rid of us. You would like us to go. No, I had to go find them. And it turned out there was a hotel for old people. They lived there just 2 miles from my house in Washington, D.C., which is where I wandered into. And I mean, I said I wanted to teach a dance class, and they thought I was crazy. I just remind you, this is 1975. It's pre-jogging. You have to picture the United States, nobody out running, nobody half naked out there stretching against lampposts, nothing like that, and certainly no old people. So I'm not going to go into a lot of those stories, other than to say that once I wandered in and found them and they found me, my entire life changed. I actually spent 10 years at this senior center working with them. They ended up, we made the piece about my mother's death. They were fantastic. I thought the project was over. I was going to leave. They said, what's next? And that's why I stayed. But when I was finding all this joy, and I must say care for me, my professional dance world was really surprised. In fact, they started to demote me. They began to call me a social worker. I'm sorry if there's social workers here, but or a therapist. Like, it was somehow not possible to be both an artist and a person working in the world. This was the beginning of this question for me that I'm going to keep coming back to over and over again, is how do we construct a life for ourselves that lets us pursue what we see as important, lets us make the world the way we know it needs to be made, despite the constraints of our own profession, of our own family, of our own faith, whatever it is. So here's what it was like. It would be something like this. People would say to me, Liz, the work you do at the Kennedy Center, because I had formed a company. We were starting to tour. We were actually performing at the Kennedy Center. That's up here. And the stuff that you do, like at the Roosevelt Hotel for Senior Citizens and Children's Hospital and some of those other things you're doing, that's done. Or people would say this. Wait a minute, that stuff you're doing in the community, that is awesome. Wow. Why are you still bothering to perform on the stage? It's white, it's elitist, it's old, it's European, it's, you know, how many bad things could you say about it? All those things. And, you know, this is the thing. I loved my theater world. I loved it. I didn't love everything about it, but I loved it. And I loved the work I was doing at the Roosevelt, and so I did this, which is really easy to do with my hands. But it is essential to me now as a way of seeing the world. What an impoverished choice someone would ask of me to prove my professionalism by staying in the studio, or to prove my activism in a very particular way. Well, go into the community. Once I began to do this, I saw that much of the world is set up this way. Nurture, rigor, choose. Individual, collective, choose. Creative research, scientific research, choose. Ballet, folk, choose. You see where I'm going. It's constant. We make these hierarchies everywhere. And the act of this is an act of belief, defiance, and requires a change of behaviors. I contend that we learn our behaviors in this world, and we are trying to this world. In fact, for many of you sitting here especially, well, many of you are already in this world. We are, because of so many of the pressures in what's happening. So that's like a basic concept that I want to sort of explore, so that as you come with me on some of the things I'm going to describe, it's not either or. You don't have to sit there saying, yeah, but if I go think about this kind of research, what's going to happen to my graduate paper? You'll be okay. It's all right, because we're going to do this. And we're going to see that there's so much power in the way we are being trained, and there's so many pressures on us to change that. So that's kind of a prologue. The second part of this little prologue, before I open the curtain, is just to say a couple of quick things about how this works, some of this transdomain stuff, because then I'm going to get into some stories where it might not be as clear. But by way of example, I got a call from an art gallery well, actually, it's the major museum in Seattle, that was showing an exhibit called Biogenesis. And this was an exhibit that was touring the world of visual artists dealing with DNA. So all of the work in the show had living and bits of DNA in it. This is the show where there was the green rabbit. Some of you may have seen or know about that. And these artists are really interesting. They were ahead of the scientists. They had a whole set of protocols about what they were doing and why they were doing it and how they were doing it. But the exhibit had caused an uproar in Seattle. And they called me because of this critical response process, which is a system of giving feedback, and they thought I could come and help. I couldn't. I couldn't use critical response because none of the artists were present, and you need them present to have the discussion. But I was really, really interested in the problem. I think it's fantastic when the public gets riled up about art. I mean, it's more interesting when the public does than when the government does, but it is fantastic because there's such an opportunity to get in there and try to figure out what is happening to people. So I agreed to come out, and we ended up doing actually quite a bit of work with a various number of ways of working with the public in relationship to the art. But I said to them on the phone, I don't know anything about genetics, because this is all about this DNA. And they said, that's okay. They overnighted me about 4 pounds worth of just like this, of stuff. They sent me the really scary stuff. No wonder the people in Seattle were scared. The stuff about chimeras, the stuff about all the change in reproduction. And our daughter at the time was in high school, and I thought, you know, she's going to have so many different choices about reproduction than we did, just based on some of the stuff I was reading. So I said to myself, I don't know anything about genetics, but if I make a dance about it, by the time I'm done, I'll know something. And that is the baseline of this idea about creative research. That's it. That the process of, well, I knew I was going to make something. There'd be some kind of set of experiences that the public would be invited into that we call a performance, but I wasn't even sure what kind that would be, but that I would, somewhere down the line, after researching and researching and researching, we would make something and something would happen to the public. And maybe there'd be some conversation about it. Although I had been doing creative research for years, I think it was stumbling into the work with the scientists that got me to begin to really articulate it, what it is, why it's important. And also because almost all the work with the scientists took place on campuses, I began to understand in a whole different way than I had from my work in communities and my work in other kinds of touring I'd done, that we, people doing creative research, have something big to offer if we could articulate what it is, if we could make it available to people, if we could repeat it, which, you know, of course is a real problem in the arts, right? What's one of the first things we're always told? Don't repeat yourself. Don't repeat yourself, which is nuts. I mean, talk about the training. Endless repetitions. So that's kind of where I want to go, and I'll end this little prologue with one of the stories, meaning the scientists. I'd already premiered the work. It was called Ferocious Beauty Genome, and there was a section of it that I was really frustrated with. I really knew I could make it better. In this section, I was trying to compare what happened in the rehearsal studio to what happens to scientists in their laboratories. And it was very complicated fugue. We were doing a lot of work with multimedia for the first time, lots of video and interaction stuff. I just knew it could be better. And I happened to be visiting a science friend of mine at Princeton, and she took me down the hall to meet her friend, a Nobel laureate, named Eric Wieshaus. He's a fruit fly geneticist. And by now, I had made actually a sort of, you know, the dying swan, which was the great 19th century. This was still the 20th century when I did this piece, but I thought, oh, the dying fruit fly was like really the right version because, you know, they sacrificed a lot for us to know what we know. I mean, when you think about it, how many thousands and millions of fruit flies have given themselves so that we know something about ourselves? So I was quite moved by the fruit flies. So I went into his lab and I met him, and, you know, I said, and here was the thing, I said, how do you ask yourself a question? Because that was at the heart of this section in the piece. How do you ask a question? And he said, I'm fueled by my ignorance. Is that not fantastic? I am fueled by my ignorance. And he's a Nobel laureate. And that was again, one of those moments where I just, well, first I wish that would be the headline in the paper. Nobel laureate says he's fueled by his ignorance. That would help a lot. We were about to jump into Iraq, and you know, I just thought there are other ways to deal with not knowing than what the country chose to do. And it had, again, this idea that not knowing something can actually be the engine that drives you. This is so fantastic. And this is a little bit of the relationship then between how artists think and how scientists think and others think as they do their research. Now, as we get ready to open the curtain, I'm going to tell some more stories once that curtain's open. I know I'm a little messy around these definitions, and that there are some fantastic work being done defining the difference between research that grows out of practice, research that's done empirically, research that there's some really excellent ideas, and I wondered if you'd like to hear one of them. I'm going to read it to you, but I'm not following it. But I think it's a... Well, I say that because it's so... I was reminded of it when I was trying to plan for this talk. I think she's done some really interesting distinctions here. I myself am too permeable to follow this, but her name is Jen Webb, and she is a scientist up in... she's up in Canada, and she writes this about creative work as practice, the new paradigm, and she's talking about practice-led research. And she says, among other things, there are three kinds. Research for practice. That's when you're generating data that will provide knowledge about the content in the context of your current project. So the months I spent talking to scientists in order to make Ferocious Beauty, the numbers of interactions I had with people, that's the research for practice. Then she says research into practice. That's generating knowledge about the technique, the approaches, the thinking, the how of it. That's what I'm doing here at the IRC. How all this, what is this, what is the nature of creative research? And then her third thing is research through practice, using your creative techniques along with more conventional methodologies to generate knowledge about social, political, philosophical, and other issues. So I think that's kind of an interesting thing, and now we'll open the curtain, and we're more on a stage now where things can interact a little bit more. But I'm going to pause for a second and see if anybody has any questions before we move on. You know, you have to move around for a minute and get your brain going, or... Yes.
Hi. I am in the LLC program. My name is Lisa, and I'm in the doctoral LLC program, but my undergraduate degree is in biochem. And so it's rather interesting hearing you talk about the Nobel laureate who said he was fueled by his ignorance. That's the way I approach most of, coming from a different discipline, learning about language, literacy, and culture. I'm fueled by lots of questions.
Yes.
And so by asking questions, I learn. And what I'm realizing is that depending on the discipline that you're in, when you ask questions, you get a different type of, people interpret it differently.
Yes.
Right? And so it's that, like you're talking, it's that, the contradiction of how you present yourself, how you learn in one discipline versus another.
Yes, and I think we're going to come and look at those questions. I think that is, it's one reason to spend time in other disciplines is in order to have that opportunity to rethink and reflect, including when it's based on misunderstandings. They just don't know, right?
Do you have an advice for anybody with that, is doing that cross-discipline or interdisciplinary learning that can somehow be easily assimilated or assimilated into a different discipline where the questions being asked is more seen as inquiry versus challenging?
Yes. So can we keep that question in mind? It's a great question to sort of lay over this next part of our conversation. But even the last thing that she said, the nature of inquiry, when does that make us defensive? When does that make us want to deepen what we're doing, and how does that work? Which I think is a very interesting behavioral question. You see, if I go back to this world, the hierarchical world, one thing about that world is it's pretty singular. This is right and this is wrong. What happens when you go this way is you begin to have a multiplicity. And that's where you want the multiplicity. You don't, that's the singular issue where someone might come at you and say, but wait, it's not like that. It's like helping them see, wait a minute, you may also be right, but so am I, and here's how. So if we've opened the curtain, there's sort of three little circles of light. I want to spend time in each of these little circles with a story and then some underlying things that I think relate to some of this that we're talking about, at least I hope so. I was in Japan with my company to do a big project that was an intergenerational community-based project. The Japanese got very, very interested in the fact that my dance company had people ranging from 20s into their 70s and 80s. Why? Because their country has some issues around aging and who's going to take care of the older people, because the tradition of the woman taking care of them was breaking down, and they hadn't let immigrants into the country, so they didn't have that pool of people. They're really struggling. And some arts people came across the fact that we were doing this work. So this was maybe our second or third trip over. The structure of these residencies was we would work with the young professional dance artists, a group of old people who were not dancers, and then our company, and we would make something based on what we were learning of their stories. In Japan, they had a history of older people being artists, but they were the master artists. They were people who had been artists their whole life and who therefore could be. This notion that you could be just anybody and happened to get old and start dancing was really a new idea to them. And somewhat in our country too. But so they took me to meet not the head of the Ahi beer company, but like pretty high up, because he was responsible for funding contemporary art in Japan. And it was said that he liked contemporary dance. So we went, I went in to meet him. I had a translator. And he, I'm generalizing a little bit here, but really in a very uncharacteristic way, he began to yell at me. I mean, it was uncharacteristic. The Japanese are so polite and gentle when they meet you. In fact, he was so loud that my translator got really embarrassed and wouldn't tell me what he was saying. But I convinced him to tell me, and I found out much later he had watered it down quite a bit. But what he said is that this man was really angry that I was an American, that he did not want any more American influence in his country, culturally. Why couldn't I be from Malaysia, he said. You know, well, I was completely fascinated and said back, what an interesting question. I mean, he didn't ask me a question. He didn't. He's on me. But that little moment, what an interesting question. And then I said to him, what is the nature of influence? I mean, when do we want to be influenced? Why do we want to be influenced? When does that happen? And I said to him, look, I'm here in your country because I want to be influenced. I'm open. I said, but there have been times in my life when I didn't want to be influenced, when it was a kind of a period of, no, I wouldn't call it contraction, but I would say a period of, don't bother me, I'm trying to sort this thing out and I need this kind of internal space. Well, it led to a fantastic conversation. We had a wonderful hour together about that. But it also put in front of me a way of thinking about this that I had never thought about before, which was, when are we? Where in our research is it permissible to be open to influence? Now, I think different fields would say different things about it, but I would say that in the art world, if I open myself to influence, I might be called out for, well, you must be compromising your principles. You might not be as pure as you should be. And yet, I have found over and over that being open to what's happening in the context of, say, rehearsals, because that's, of course, what happens in rehearsal, right? You set something up, you say, I'm going to try this, I'm going to test this. Oh, but wait, the way you've got your legs crossed, so much more interesting than what I had in mind. I'm going to do that. I like your version. That's being open to influence. Small, but open. When I started working with the scientists, this is an interesting thing to explore. I found, first of all, they were very eager to influence my work. Let's just say, really interested. Liz, this is how you can do DNA. It's inert. Lie down. Make the dancers lie down. They were like, they had a million ideas for how to do it, which actually led to a very interesting set of, I started asking in every interview, if you had the dancers, how would you have them move to do your form of research? And it forced the scientists to reconceive in their mind a way of thinking and seeing their work that was actually turned out to be quite profound. But at the time, it was kind of more of a joke. But it did get me thinking also about this. One of the distinctions I would say between some of the scientists that I was working with and my work was the relationship to the personal. Like, who gets to be personal when? Like, I think artists, for example, I think we are encouraged to do personal expression. Sometimes I think actually the more personal you are, the less money you make in this world. I think there may be some equation related to that. I'm not sure, but I think so. But the scientists are quite intent on keeping the personal out of their research. I don't know if you agree or don't agree with this, but I think it's interesting. And I began to ask my myself and other artists, well, what kind of membranes do we set up? Because, we're not personal all the time. Like, you know a lot about me, but you don't know everything about me. It's not like everything, right? I mean, we have systems by which we make sure the personal isn't there or is there. So when Hiking the Horizontal came out, because it was a Wesleyan Press that published it, and I had done so much work at Wesleyan, we did a reading, and all the scientists that had helped me at Wesleyan, and there were many, came to the reading, which I just loved. And they all sat in a row, and one of them had a question about what was it like to be published. And I talked about how interesting it was to have the book and to have it be personal. And then I said to them, and I have an idea for you guys. I think that you should write your articles twice. The first time you write the article, you should write like you always write for your science journals. And then you should write another one, the same one, except this time you should include all the personal reasons why you wrote that, why you felt that way, why you made that decision, why you did this. And it was a riot. They were like this on their chairs listening to me, but when I said that second idea, the whole row, why does this matter? I'm back to this. I'm back to the nature of change. I'm back to the nature of how we want to live our full lives. You ask, at least the scientists I met, if you ask them why they did their work, none of them cited the scientific method. Nobody went into that kind of thing. They talk personally. So, in general, thinking about this idea of what makes us open to influence and how are we open to influence and why we think about that within our research, where is the personal? And I know in the humanities world this has been raging for years, and I'm sort of new to the party, but I think it's well worth our understanding and understanding how we absorb the influence and when we don't, because of course we're not always open. The door is not always open. Okay, so I have a little research assignment for you while you're listening. Sometimes I'm interested in what pictures come into your mind when, say, someone's talking. Like what happens in your imagination? I know you may be thinking about how what I'm saying, like what the words have to do with your life, but I'm just curious if anybody had any pictures pop in the last few minutes. Or now that I've said it, does anybody have any pictures in their mind from this? Yeah.
You're talking about the reaction to your second time writing the paper idea. I don't know if anyone's seen Clue, but there's that moment when she's talking about chopping off a member, and all of the men in the room are like, and I saw that visual of the three legs going.
Great. It's funny that's the thing that popped in that. Anybody else? Pictures coming in? And now that I've mentioned it, maybe something has? I'm going to encourage you to notice. If you do pay attention to the pictures, you might lose my language for a while. It's hard to do both at the same time, but it's okay. You can miss me and go for the pictures. I'm quite intrigued. So, anybody have any questions before I go? Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, it seems pretty clear, but just about how the posture closes in and collapses, and then versus being open with your shoulders open and your torso and your abdomen being exposed, and being grounded enough to not be afraid of having that vulnerability and influence.
And is that the picture you saw in your head?
Well, I was watching you do it and kind of feeling it as you were doing it, and knowing the difference for me when I'm in this posture and feeling vulnerable, and this posture feeling ready to take something in or take it on.
So you've raised a new question, which is the question of embodiment. So let's go there. And that's our little second circle. But I encourage you, anytime you want to pop up into that beautiful imagination you have. When we worked with the physicists and they said, they were speculating about multiple worlds, there are multiple universes. I'm saying, well, of course there are. There are at least two, this one and then this one. And we just don't harness it very much, but it's up there. I'm convinced every single second you've got beautiful, beautiful pictures popping in up there. And they're well worth researching, because they'll tell you a lot about what part of yourself is coming forward to meet whatever is happening to you, including this particular talk. Anybody get a picture? Yeah.
Well, you contribute to the pictures. I mean, it's a lot of what you're saying resonates with me. I mean, I do field work. A lot of what I do in the field technically is very, very rigorous. But the picture that pops into my mind when you talk about the performance, right, of doing research, is one that's very central for me. I see myself in the field. I love being there. I'm very much in the moment when I'm in the field. I love the sensations of being outside and being in the location where I work and of the physicality of it. So it's related to the question of embodiment you mentioned earlier.
Great. Did anybody get a picture? What's your name?
Michael.
What, as Michael was speaking, a very vivid thing he was saying. Did you get a picture? What? What's the picture that came into your mind? Tell me.
Being in the environment.
Being in the environment? What environment? Can you tell it to us?
I saw a field, a green field.
You saw it. What green field?
With fresh air, just my green field.
That's my point. Did anybody see Michael's field? No. Unless you happened to go with Michael out into his field.
What field did you see? Yeah. You saw yours. And I bet you if we went around and said, be specific, very particular fields from your past would come into your imagination. Not just any field. He was so happy. So you're not going to pick a field when you weren't happy. You're going to, it's going to, and this is just such a fantastic part of ourselves. We don't use. We don't. Imagine if your freshman year here, one of your courses was learning how to harvest what's happening in your imagination when you're in those lecture courses. Imagine how much richer, what would happen? What would happen? Now, I promise you, you'll lose some of the text. It's really hard. I've been working on this for years. I can sometimes keep myself in two places. It's really hard. So once I gave a graduation speech, and I just said to them all, just go imagine for the rest of the speech. Because I'm a big believer in daydreaming. I just so think it's so beautiful. And this is one of the reasons why. Is because the capacity of your brains to bring to bear something so personal in your life to something as new to you as the fact that there's somebody working in the field over here. Yes.
Of this field, but I was struck more with other senses. So the feeling of sun or the smell or the wind. So it wasn't visual, it was more of these other issues of embodiment that I think resonated with me.
Right. And if we're researching and we're interested in what questions to ask, we might suddenly be asking ourselves, gee, what's the relationship of the sun to the particular thing? I mean, Michael probably asks that all the time, but just in case he didn't, we have potentially a new research question based on what has just popped into this incredible imagination. That's part of the harvesting is then bringing it into relationship with what you're thinking about. So after I started working with these older people, as I mentioned, we stayed together for a very long time, and eventually they were part of the company that we toured with. And I got in 1983, I was asked to make a piece for the anniversary of the Statue of Liberty. It must have been the 100th, but maybe it was the 150th. I'm sorry, I've lost that detail. But there were 3 American choreographers and 3 French choreographers, and we went there. And I made a piece called Still Crossing in honor of my grandfather, who had walked across Russia in order to get out of that country and come here. And the piece consisted of 2 big sections, 3 sections for the older people. The first was they rolled across the floor while younger dancers were doing these duets. And these were really, really old people. So rolling was really hard. In fact, one of them, he said to me, I'm not rolling. He said, call it still crashing, because his body would be like, but it was really kind of shocking to see this slow sort of thing. And then they had another part where they came out and slowly filled the stage until the stage was full. And there was one part in that ending where they were facing, you had to face one direction. You had to look back. I mean, you had one arm here, one arm here. You had to keep your body going in 2 directions. It's actually hard to do. It's a nice stretch, but it's hard to do. And if your body's old, it's really hard to do. And we toured this piece for quite a while. There was a lot of interest in this, and everywhere we went to new communities, we would teach a group of older people, we would get a new batch. And that would be part of why it worked in communities. And we were in one place where this woman came up to me, older woman who was dancing with us that week. And she said, well, we had gotten into a process where we asked people to talk about their own immigration stories. And we worked hard to work around people who may have been adopted, because there's a whole different thing there. And if people were Native American and or African American, we had other ways of talking about the nature of what it meant to come over, because it was not all, it wasn't always towards freedom. So we had these conversations. But this woman said that her husband of 50 years had died only like 3 weeks earlier. And she said she felt like this movement was teaching her about widowhood and what it meant for her life to move on. And she said at a cellular level, it finally connected to her that she was now without him. And again, it's a simple story, but it is one of these profound things that if we allow ourselves to experience using our body, not only does our body tell us things that we didn't know, but it helps us get to where we want to go. And in that sense, embodied practice in relationship to research seems to me essential. Whether you're just taking yourself with your body into the field as one form, but it just seems essential. And like our imagination, it is something we have sorely left out. We could spend, of course, a lot of time talking about why we've left it out, but it's a great sadness to me. So in the context of the work that I've been doing in other fields, there's been a slow movement towards using physicality, using movement to help people with their research, specifically in the scientific community, which I can get into. But I'm going to pause for a minute and see if anybody has any questions or thoughts about that. I'm going to check my watch. Is it really that late? No, I didn't realize it was so late. Anybody? Question? I'm double checking. No? All right, then I'm going to move on really quickly. I want to just tell you one more story because there was one more circle. And then I do want to take some real time for questions and comments and things that may be on your mind. When I started working on the Ferocious Beauty genome, the genetics piece, I decided to get a group of scientists who would help me make sure the science was right, whatever that meant. I have subsequently wished that scientists would have artist committees that would help them get the art right, but that is a long haul that I'm working on. It was really wonderful. They were fantastic. And there are two parts of this. One story was just that I had come across the term protein folding, which interested me because it's a verb. I thought, good, that's something we can work on in the studio. We can at least go in there and start folding. And we did. And one of the dancers asked this question, is this one fold or is this an infinite number of folds? And I sent out a little note to the scientists and said, what is that? And they were thrilled. They said, what a great question. That's one of our problems. That's what we're trying. But they also said this. I also got back from them. One person wrote and said, I don't know how you got into protein folding so fast. It's like one of the biggest things in our field. How did you figure out that that's a question? And another one wrote back and said, Liz, skip the protein folding. It's really hard to understand. Just stick with the ethics. You know, get rid of the protein folding. Just jump to the ethics. As if ethics is easier. But at one point we had built enough material that I brought them to the audience, to come be audience and to watch something we're working on. And it happened to be a little section about DNA. And I was trying to work in this piece. I was trying to give science delivery methods in the first act and then in the second act to talk about evolution, death, and perfection. Those were the three things I wanted to address. But I felt like you needed to get a little bit into the science world in order to get at those questions. So, and Gregor Mendel, you remember him, the father of genetics? He's like the spiritual guide of the piece. He's kind of like a narrator of the piece. I was very interested that he was a religious person and a scientist, and I thought, that's fantastic. That's a wonderful way. So they watched a dance of his, and two things happened in this little gathering. The first was one of the scientists pointed out to something in the DNA section and said, that's wrong. I said, it's not wrong. Look. And I took him the article I had read on which I had based it. And then he said, well, that's wrong. The article's wrong. So this idea about truth, right, wrong, that was interesting to me because I think the public and my own perception of science was that that's what they're after, when in fact there's way more latitude even in something as supposedly understood as how DNA splits, how it replicates itself. But the other one was Gregor Mendel. This particular beautiful dancer, at one point in this dance, and it's a dance of isolation because, Mendel lived alone and he was this obsessive, he was fantastic, a really obsessive guy. But I can't remember why we did this, but there was a little handstand in the choreography, and he goes up on one hand, maybe because the dancer had been studying capoeira. I don't know, but up he goes. And at the end of that, one of the science advisors goes, excuse me, but Gregor Mendel wouldn't have done that. Isn't that interesting? I was fascinated. Like, at what point is it about the truth? Like, really? And what was my job? And was there some way that I was like the fiction of it was like, I mean, we can laugh, but maybe there'd be more serious fictions that I might put forward. This is an area that I feel the convergence of thinking about research on the whole, across a campus, not separating creative research from scientific research, from humanities research, but thinking about how we help our public and ourselves figure out the multiplicity even about something as serious as truth. Because that's really the world we're in. And the struggle to help our audience, to help our public get that seems huge to me. In relationship to research, then I'll just say one more thing on the subject of truth. When we were commissioned by the Harvard Law School to make a piece about human rights law, what had happened since Nuremberg, this was in a really wonderful project which I'd love to show you clips of someday, or even do here someday. I think it'd be really interesting. I learned, and maybe you guys know this, that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa has 4 definitions of truth. Did you know this? That in order for them to deal with the history and what happened in that country and to get to reconciliation, they needed 4. They put 4 into the document, and it is what they say. So the one is forensic truth, which they mean the facts. The facts. One is moral truth, which they define as the wrongdoing. And in that case, and I can't remember now, but I don't know how that makes itself evident precisely, but they called it moral truth. Then they had social truth, which they believed was the outcome of the knowledge that would come from argument, from discourse, from confrontation, from the courtroom, from people talking about it. That there was a social truth that would emerge, which makes me think that it's incumbent upon us to give ourselves places for that social truth to emerge, actually, to bring the differences together someplace, to think about that. And then the 4th was personal or narrative truth, which is the right of each person to tell their story in their own way, which we know is an essential part of art making. Okay. So let's pause. See if you have questions, comments, things on your mind from what's been going on so far. I'll give you a little time to think. Nice deep breath you took. That was beautiful. Maybe everybody should take a nice deep breath. Yeah. Question, Andres. What? Oh yeah, we kept it. We loved it. Yeah. Actually, I'm remembering now. It was Mendel had written a poem actually, and we used the poem to underline. And it happened to it went with something in the poem, and it was really fun for people to get to know the poem. But yeah, we kept it. Yeah. Yes. And let me go over here. Just somebody. Yeah.
Truth is very interesting to me because when I teach, I teach composition, and when I teach my students, how to compose, what I'm looking for in their music is that they're telling me the truth about themselves in their music. And it's interesting to me, I think I know when that's so, but I don't always know when that's so. And the truth in my studio when I'm looking at their music on paper as opposed to the truth in performance is another thing then on top of that. So
That's really delicious. That's such an interesting set of. Could you all hear that? That the nature of and it's true, right? There's the way it is, and then there's the way it again when we have to perform and.
Yeah, and finding that for themselves to me is the goal of education. You know, that's why they're here. But I'm not exactly sure how I do it, or if I do it, if I'm successful all the time. You know, what's true for me in that process too is another question. So
That's really interesting. I know, speaking for myself, just as a performer, I had a terrible time when I was performing. If in most formal theaters the lights are out, and I'm on stage, I'm lit, and you're not. And I honestly hardly could ever figure out why. Why? And I actually, speaking of my profession, I would make sure that there was a house light up somehow, so I could see the audience. Otherwise, I couldn't do it. And that was sort of my solution to the dilemma of what kind of fiction or truth we were creating. So, yeah.
I think as a documentary photographer, even I'm struggling with truth and kind of grappling with whose truth I'm documenting. Is it, you know, from my perspective or from theirs? And I'm never going to get theirs, but yeah, I think that the idea of multiple truths
is helpful, perhaps, in that. And I think, you know, we really didn't get into it. And I spent much more of the time talking about the work with the scientists, but if we were to spend more time now talking about what happens when we take our art and our research into communities, then what's going on, whose story, which story, and how do we make sure about the kinds of questions you posed. I'll just say in the shipyard project, which is one we did for 18 months back and forth to the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard, where we collected so many stories because the shipyard was on the closing list. It ended up not closing, but we had way more stories than we could ever use. And we ended up, in that case, making a beautiful ritual and turning the stories over to the community and then into the library, so that at least people knew that there was a place for what they had told. But I think it's a great question that you're asking. Our daughter is a documentary photographer, and so we, becoming one. And it's a really good question. Yeah. Anybody have a picture in their mind, incidentally, when she mentioned this? About being a documentary photographer? Did anything pop into your imaginations? And does it now? Yeah, Andres.
I mean, I was just thinking, kind of having like a flutter of images that from like National Geographic go through my mind. No one in particular, but just ones that I remember.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, anybody else? Yeah?
Well, going off National Geographic, I remember the guy taking a picture of the lion that almost attacked him recently.
Right. So just the other day, right. Yes, I've been talking to neuroscientists about this because I really want to try to understand what these pictures are. And one that I spent some time with feels that our imagination and our experience are the same thing. That, in other words, we picture what our experience is, which is a little bit daunting for artists because, of course, we're trying to hope that we can move people's imagination actually past maybe their own experience, right? It came up because I'm working on a piece about poverty and wealth and its impact on the body. And when you say the word poverty in America, I think the first picture you have is probably of an African American, when in fact the statistics are actually that it's most likely a white person. And so I had wanted to find out from the scientists how many pictures of poor white people would I need to put up for people to change the picture. Like, would it be 1,000? Would it be, how long? And then I thought that would be the piece, that you'd come in, you'd sit down, and you'd watch until your imagination changed. And that's what. What's that? It is, yeah. But it was interesting, and then it raises the question for us about how much, the fact that National Geographic came up. It's not that either of you two have been photographers for that or gone there, but the fact that the magazine itself, pops up right away. It's interesting. Yes, questions? Yes.
I hope I'm not talking too much, but on TED Talks there was a woman that presented from Africa. I don't remember her name and I don't remember which country, but she talks about the single story and how there is no single story, and that all the ways that had kind of limited her understanding and then people's understanding of her.
I really think helping people manage multiplicity is one of our tasks now. And still knowing that there's a truth. When our daughter was little, you know, you have a new definition of good movies because you have to watch the same movie like 50 times, you know, and then she goes on to the next movie. But there was a period when we were watching Fiddler on the Roof an awful lot. And we got to the part where the sheriff comes and says to the family, you know, that you have to move, you have to leave. I'm sorry, you know, they were friends. The sheriff and the Jewish family are friends, but now he's saying, you have to leave. And my daughter says to me, is he evil? And I said, well, honey, let's think about this for a minute. And, and then she goes, Mother, sometimes, you know, people are just bad. I mean, it was really interesting. Like this, maybe sometimes there isn't multiplicity. And then I helped myself by going back to this construct and saying, well, one of the constructs might be over here is multiplicity and over here is actually a singular truth to which we abide or something like that. Yes?
In terms of education, you talked about imagination and creativity. How do you see that? Because I do agree. I think that within science education that needs to be encouraged and implemented more.
Can you repeat the question?
Thank you. I will repeat the question. Yes. Thank you.
So I was wondering, how do you see science educators using the creativity, the imagination to foster, you know, encouragement into the science field?
Right. So the question is about science education and how we can use creativity there. And I just want to say that in many of the art-science dialogues, one of the first things that comes up is the artists will say, we're not in this to serve science. That's the first thing you'll hear. So I just want to say, you know, it's not that's this. And that actually sometimes serving the scientist is thrilling. In my case, in my field, we hardly ever do anything but abstraction. So if you actually want to serve an illustrator, it's a good task to learn how to figure out how to be so specific that it's understandable. So there's usefulness in it. But there's a lot going on in science education. We can check in about that afterwards, but there's a lot happening where there's tremendous amount going on between artists and scientists. Maybe time for one or two more and then we'll break. Yes. What's that?
I was going to ask if you could show us whatever you were.
Oh, okay. Let me take this question and then can we do let's do the
Yeah, you'll have to log back in.
I do?
Yes, because it turned off.
Okay, I'm gonna log in, hold on a minute, and then I have to put this down for a second. Everybody, you can stretch. That's good, you took me seriously. Awesome. Yes, your grades are gonna be so much better. Let me do this question, then we'll watch a video, and then we will stop. Yes.
Do you find that people at different stages of their careers, and I'm specifically talking about undergraduate, graduate students, early academics or early scientists and scientists later in their career, do you find that they have different levels of accepting that this?
Yeah, the question about when in our careers can we accept the notion either of multiple ways of seeing, or when do we drop off the path of what our profession expects of us? I think is that part of
at each stage, are people more open to that? It seems like graduate students at some point, you know, we're being socialized to definitely not do that.
Yeah.
But undergraduates might have a more ideal vision of the world, and then maybe later on, I'm thinking people would know by then they're finished the early career struggles,
Yeah.
and now they can be more open.
You know, I really, I grew up in a family in which my father was such a social activist that I don't think there was ever a day when we weren't expected to change something. So I'm not the best person to ask in a way, because it's fine. The rules are there because somebody decided they must be fruitful. somebody somewhere must have said, this is a good reason to make people do this and to behave this way. Wouldn't you think?
Sure.
But I'm wondering if that's still true. And so, like I like to say, in this world, this is right, this is wrong. In this world, it's all has to be right. You don't get a free pass. You actually have to be at your best every single second. Even, or sometimes I say, and this is a little artistic way to say it, but in this world, the cutting edge is up here. Maybe it's next wave at BAM or something like that, some festival. But in this world, cutting edge can be in a second grade classroom. And we know that there's cutting edge art happening in second grade classrooms. We know that. So what I want to encourage you is to ask the underlying question, what is it I need to be doing? How am I going to do this? What is important to me to do? And do I have to nudge my profession in order to do it? Like, I know the school has certain requirements. That's when I say to people, be like water. Be like water, seep around, go, don't fight every battle, go under it, go around, Because our institutions try nobly, and I know our dean is here, it's right here, try really nobly to do the right thing by you. But the world is changing out there. And if you see that you have to do something differently, talk to the dean. Because the school wants you to be prepared for what's out there, not what used to be out there, but for what's out there now. And swallow the fear and sort of push for it. Okay, do you think we're almost there? This video was made for it. Well, just watch it. It was a quick set of clips. that's a little bit of the idea of it. Thank you. I think we'll stop. I think there's things to food, and thanks again to our wonderful Humanities Forum people, and we're around to talk. You've been wonderful. Thank you.